Okay, so 4-6 is the next section, inverse and determinants. For those of you who participated in the matrix unit and system of equations unit that we were doing with the lessons from last week with the beginning of the matrices, a lot of this is going to be repetitive. There is some overlap between the section and the sections that came from the Algebra 2 book. So hopefully this will be review for some of you, and then those of you who missed it last week or didn't get everything, hopefully you can figure this out this week. So we're going to be talking about inverses again and then determinants again and learning some new material to go with that. So the first thing we're talking about is an inverse of a matrix, and how do you know if something's an inverse? If the matrices are inverse, when you multiply them, their product should come out to be 1, 0, 0, 1. So that's what you get for a product if your matrix is inverse. So to determine if two matrices are inverses, what you're going to do is multiply them together and see if that's the product you get. So we have 5, 6, 4, 5 times 5, -6, -4, 5. And if we think about our rows and columns, we're going to multiply. We multiply the rows on this one by the columns on this one. So we're going to multiply 5 times 5 is 25, plus 6 times -4 is -24. And then we do this row by this column. 5 times -6 is -30, plus 6 times 5 is 30. Then we go to the next row. 4 times 5 is 20, plus 5 times -4 is -20. And then 4 times -6 is -24, and 5 times 5 is 25. And if we simplify that, 25 plus -4, 24 is 1. -30 plus 30 is 0. 20 plus -20 is 0. And -24 plus 25 is 1. So yes, this is an inverse because the product of them. And if you multiply these in the opposite order and did this B times A instead, because this is A times B, if you did B times A, it would give you the same result. So now you're going to do this number 2 on your own, determine if those are inverses. So if something can make an inverse, if you can get an inverse, it's called invertible. So invertible is when a matrix has an inverse, and singular means the matrix will not have an inverse. So those are just terms you might be using as you go. So one method to find the inverse of a square matrix is to use a system of equations, and we can use a double augmented matrix and use our row echelon that we learned about to do this. So to find the inverse of a square matrix, what we're going to do is we're going to make our augmented matrix. So we're going to do 8, -5, -3, 2, and then we're going to go like this, and we're going to put our inverse, 1, 0, 0, 1. So that's what the inverse would look like. And now we're going to solve to get our pattern. So this needs to be a 1 is our first step. So how do you make the 8 a 1? So that's our first row. We need to make this a 1. So to make the 8 a 1, I was looking, and you only have these numbers to work with. So if I do -3 times row 2, so that would make this +9, and minus row 1, I can get +1. So -3 times -3 is 9, minus 8 is 1. So then if I do the same thing, -3 times 2 is -6, minus a -5 would be -3. Oops. -6 minus a -5 would be -1, sorry. Okay, so -6 minus a -5 makes +5 would be -1. -3 times 0 is 0, minus a 1 would be -1. -3 times 1 is 3, minus 0 is -3. Okay, so then the next row stays exactly the same. Okay, this is from the lesson yesterday, so the next row stays the same. Now we need to do this number needs to be 0. So we keep our first row the same. And we're going to make this 0. So how do we make this 0? If we do 3 times row 1 plus row 2. 3 times 1 is 1, or 3 times 1 is 3, plus -3 is 0. 3 times -1 is -3, plus 2 is -1. 3 times -1 is -3, plus 0. is -3. And then 3 times -3 is -9, plus 1 is -8. Okay, so we're going to keep going. We're going to, again, keep trying to move these numbers. So the next thing is we need to make this -1 a 0. So how do we make that -1 a 0? So again, we're going to put the line we're trying to make is here. So we're making this a 0. To get that to be 0, we're going to do row 1 minus row 2. So 1 minus 0 is 1. -1 minus -1 is 0. -1 minus a -3 would be +2. And -3 minus a -8 is +5. And then we have the second row stays the same. And then our last thing is we need to make this -1 positive. So we have 1, 0, 2, 5. And then we have 0. We need to make this +1. In order to do that, we just do row 2 times -1. And then that will make them all change signs. And now, instead of having the inverse on this side, we have the inverse on this side. Once that happens, our answer, or our inverse, is 2, 5, 3, 8. So it's the value we got on the other side. So we took the regular matrix, we inversed it till it got to the other side, and now we have the inverse matrix. So that is the process of doing inverses of matrices 2 by 2. So now for B, you would use the same process. Okay, so we're going to write the matrix 2, 4, -3, -6, and then we have 1, 0, 0, 1. And we're going to start by making this 2 up here into a 1. Okay, so to make this a 1, what I'm going to do is 2 times row 1 plus row 2, because 2 times 2 is 4, plus 3 would make 1. And then if I continue that, 2 times row 1, 2 times 4 is 8, plus -6 would give me 2. 2 times 1 is 2, plus 0 is 2. 2 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. And then we're going to keep our bottom row the same. So now we need to make this 3 into a 0. So the first row stays the same. To make the 3 into 0, I'm going to do 3 times row 1 plus row 2. So 3 times 1 is 3, plus -3 is 0. Okay, 3 times 2 is 6, plus -6 is 0. 3 times 2 is 6, plus 0 is 6. And 3 times 1 is 3, plus 1 is 4. And then we run into a problem because we can't make this happen because this is supposed to be 1 and 1, and that was a 0. So this is where we would write singular. Okay, it's not possible. We can't get the 1, 1 because it eliminates itself. Okay, so that's what we write as singular. So then that's one way to find the inverse of a matrix. The other way we've already learned about, so we're going to just review this way, is if you use a determinant and we had this formula, 1 over the determinant, and then we switch the letters around. So we're going to do that. So when you're going to be doing the work, which will be assigned for tomorrow that goes with this, you're going to have to do both types to show that you've learned both types. So to inverse using the determinant, the first thing it tells us to do is find the determinant and then find the inverse. To find the determinant, if you remember from the previous section, you'd multiply on the diagonal. So 2 times 4 is 8. And then you subtract multiplying the other diagonal. 8 minus, this would be -12. So the determinant is 20. So that's the first thing asked for. And then it says to find the inverse. So now we're going to use a formula. A sub 1, or A to the -1, is the inverse notation. And we're going to have 1 over the determinant, which was 20. And then we're going to switch D and A. So remember, if we remember this from the other day, you switch these two. So the 4 goes here, the 2 goes there. And the B, which is up here, becomes negative. So it becomes +3. And if we make the 4 negative, -4. So this is just a review from last week's work. If you didn't do last week's work, watch carefully. You switch A and D. So these two numbers switch. And then you change the signs. These stay in the same spot, but you change the signs. So the negative becomes a positive, the positive becomes a negative. And now you're going to distribute this. So 1/20th of 4 is 1/5. 1/20th of 3 is 3/20ths. 1/20th of -4 would be -1/5. And 1/20th of 2 is 1/10. Okay, so if you do the same thing on B, okay, we're going to first find the determinant. So we do multiply. 6 times 6 is 36, minus going this way, that would be 36. So the determinant is 0. When we go to find the inverse, that means we're doing 1 over 0. And right away, and a lot of you get stuck on this last week, that is undefined. If the determinant is 0, then it's undefined, which means we do not have an inverse. So this would be the same idea as saying it's singular. There is no inverse. Okay. And now you're going to do C on your own. And now we're going to talk about what happens with a 3 by 3. So there's two ways to do determinants of 3 by 3. We learned about the diagonal rule the other day. We're going to talk about that again. But this is now another way to use with the determinants. So you can do the formula for 3 by 3 by using this formula. So we're going to start by filling in the values. So A is -3. So we have -3, and then we have E, F, H, I, which if we look up here, that is the little square in the lower right corner. So E would be -1, F would be 2, H is 4, and I is 0. Then we have minus and whatever the B value is, which in this case is 2. And then D, F, G, I. If we look D, F, G, I, D is here, so that's 1. F is here, which is 2. G is -1, and I is 0. And then we have plus C, and C is 4. And this is D, E, G, H, which is this corner. So 1, -1, -1, 4. So now we do our determinants. So we multiply this way. So the -3 stays outside. -1 times 0 is 0. Minus 4 times 2 is 8. And then we do -2. And then if we do this, 1 times 0 is 0. Minus -2. And then plus 4. 1 times 4 is 4. Minus 1. And if we simplify with -3 times -8, minus 2 times 2, plus 4 times 3, 24 minus 4 plus 12 is 32. So that is how you do the formula, and you have to be really careful and make sure you label and think about what letters are what and plug them in the right spots, and then you should be able to get the answer. So that is the formula for doing that. You're going to do the same thing with B. And then for C, we learn the diagonal, or for this part, we learn the diagonal rule, which again will be review, as long as you did your work last week. How do we do the diagonal rule? So we write down our matrix. 5, 0, -2, 1, 2, 5, and then we copy the first two rows next to it. 2, 5, 1, -3, 0, 2. And then we're going to multiply on the diagonal. This way. So the diagonal's in this direction. There's 3 rows, so you're going to multiply 2 times 0 times 5, which would be 0. And then you're going to add it to -3 times -2 is 6, times 1 is 6, and then add that to -1 times 5 is -5, times 2 is -10. All right, and you're going to take that sum and get an answer. Then you're going to multiply on the diagonal going the other way. So from the lower corner, if we do that, 1 times 0 is 0, times -1 is 0. 2 times -2 is -4, times 2 is -8. And 5 times 5 is 25, times -3 is -75. We're going to add those together. And that's going to give us -83. And then to find the answer, you take this product, okay, the product going on the diagonals to the downward, and you're going to subtract the product going upward. And so we have -4 plus 83, which is 79. Okay, So that's how we do our diagonal rule. And then the last section is the triangle and area of a triangle. Again, so we're going to repeat this again. And to do the area of a triangle, for those of you who didn't catch on last week, you take the coordinate and you list it 0, -1. And then you take the next coordinate, -2, -6, and the next coordinate +3, -2, sorry. And then you put 1s after each of them. So these are the 3 coordinates. Doesn't matter the order you list them. And then you do the same thing, diagonal rule. So we're going to put the -0, the -2, and the 3, the -1, the -6, and the -2, and we're going to multiply on our diagonals. Zero times -6 is 0, times 1 is 0. -1 times 1 times 3 is -3, and this would be +4, and that's going to add to 1. And then we go up the other diagonal. And we get 3 times 6 is 18. This has a 0, so +0. And then this would be +2, and we get 20. Okay, so let me just check. 18, -2 times 0 would be 0. And then this would be -2 times 1 is +2. So we're going to do 1 minus 20, which is -19. Okay. Oh, I missed a negative sign, sorry. So this should be -18. My apologies. So that's going to be -16. So it's going to be 1 minus -16, which is 17. I apologize. So then that's the answer, but then the area is 1/2 of that number times that. So then this would be 8.5. And we're talking about miles squared. Okay, so again, to find the area, you do the determinant, you multiply it by 1/2. If it comes out to be negative, you just take the positive version of it. Okay, so that's all review. A lot of this section is review from last week. There are some new concepts to go with it. You are going to just do the redo parts, which is not much. Your expectation for today is to get this packet filled out. Tomorrow you will have practice of all these concepts to do, and the whole thing will be due on Wednesday night.